In today's journey, we are revisiting WinExpert's Pink Moscato and taking a look at what makes these kits updated compared to last time. Also, happy 2-year anniversary to us. These boxes are amazingly resilient, and they're definitely still using the same high quality glue. Although they did get rid of that pour spout thing that I never really understood. The reserve pack is still here, but it's no longer in a foil pouch, although it used to be called an F-pack. The wine base is still the large pack, but it's now a half-gallon smaller than it used to be. It looks like it might be a little darker too, but we'll get into that later. But it does definitely come with the exact same labels as the old kits came with. Just remember that not all WinExpert kits come with labels. They do all, however, come with a pack full of adjuncts, which do seem to contain some minor changes. They are no longer color-coded or numbered, but we still do have 30 grams of bentonite. The potassium metabisulfite and the potassium sorbate have been combined into a single package, but the weights appear to be the same, along with the fining agents. Here we have the Kesosol. The instructions are also more or less unchanged, outside of about one major change that we'll go over in this video in a second. Do remember that if you're not going to keep the box itself, you'll want to take the label off and put it here. We still have the tried and true yeast of EC1118, with very little reason to ever change that. And finally, the other half of the fining regiment, the chitosan. And if you're vegan, vegetarian, or allergic to shellfish, you'll just want to get rid of that. But let's get ready to make some wine by putting everything away that we won't be needing today, which is everything except for the bentonite, yeast, and the giant bag of wine base. And here you can see Phil showing you that label that you'll want to save for later if you're going to throw out the box. But now that we've fully inspected this kit to make sure everything's alright, we start by sanitizing everything. That's why we usually do that off camera. Then don't worry, you can see where I shove that funnel in a few seconds. First, let's get ready to prep that bentonite, where we actually see our first major change. And that's now that they actually recommend to use 2 liters of hot water to dissolve the bentonite in the bottom of the fermenter. Something to be mindful though is that if you're doing this in a glass fermenter like we are, you will want to make sure that the glass is not cold so that there's no thermal shock when you add the hot liquid. Otherwise, you could risk breaking the carboy. With the water in, we sprinkle the bentonite on top. Bentonite is a clay-based fining agent that'll help clarify the wine even if you skip using the chitosan and the Kesosol. You will probably just want to add on about another 2 to 3 weeks of clarification. But right now, we need to focus on getting this very thoroughly mixed. Phil's taking the easy way out by using a 24-inch mix stirrer on a power drill. And don't forget to check out our affiliate links in the description below, as it really helps us out, even if you end up buying something completely different. And with that thoroughly mixed, we move on to what is actually what I consider the hardest part of this entire process. And this time, we're going to do it without any pre-prep, as this cap can really be a thing of a thing. Instead of using brute force, we like to use something blunt to pry open from inside, with very little force to avoid spilling any of the juice. Just be mindful that there's always an air pocket between the opening and where the juice actually is sitting in the bladder. Otherwise, it'll start gushing out. And we don't want that to happen until we're adding it to the bentonite. And don't worry about it sloshing around, as actually incorporating oxygen at this point is good. However, once fermentation is started and alcohol is present, then oxygen becomes your enemy. You may notice that in your kit like ours, that some of the bentonite may have been clumped. That's okay, because later on we're going to stir it up again. But first, we're going to take a look at this bag and try to liberate some of this stuck-in goodness that's in there. They used to recommend hot water for this, but now they just recommend any water. Just pour some in that you were going to pour into the fermenter later anyways, shake it up, and then put it into the fermenter. This is to help ensure that no sugar is left behind and that the wine reaches its full potential. Look how saturated with color the liquid's already become. That's sugar that would have been not fermented. It's basically alcohol abuse. And it would just be general abuse if we forced you to watch us add all this water. So we will be engaging the time distortion. But this is actually about the second hardest part of the whole process. Pouring it in may be easy enough, but it's figuring out that last bit that you have to add to make it equal exactly 6 gallons. Luckily for us, we use the power of math to figure out that it is exactly 1,400 milliliters of water that we need to finish off 6 gallons. And just to recap, that was 2 liters of hot water that we added with the bentonite. The wine base was 2.11 gallons, and then we've already added an additional 3 gallons earlier. If you're worried about it, luckily we have a way to check. But first, we want to make sure that this solution is completely mixed as thoroughly as possible. Otherwise, when we take our hydrometer reading, we won't get an accurate reading. You can actually tell just by the color of the must that it's not mixed properly, just because it's darker on the bottom than it is on the top. This has to do with the fact that sugar is just denser than the rest of the water, so it needs a little help mixing together. This also gives any remaining bentonite a chance to completely dissolve, and another chance to get a bit more oxygen in there to make the yeast a bit happier. Oh, we're probably going a bit overboard here, but we want to err on the side of too much than not enough, so that we don't have to deal with doubts later. Although if you are doing this in a bucket, be mindful of going over the edge, as you could make a mess. And you may be tempted to want to do this in a 6-gallon glass carboy. We highly recommend not doing that, as it's just barely big enough. You might be tempted to want to limit as much headspace as possible, and that's important in secondary. But in primary, we're going to be outputting so much CO2 so quickly, it's not really going to matter. It's going to push all that air out. What does matter right now is getting a hydrometer or a specific gravity reading of some kind. This is how we ultimately check our math that we added the proper amount of water, and why it's probably better to err on the side of less water, because we can always top it off later. We often use a refractometer off camera whenever we're working on our projects, but we really wanted to stress how important it is to take a proper reading during this phase. Which is why Phil's also fighting the urge to do it the dirty way of just doing it in the thief. And although we've been known to do that ourselves in the past, we do really recommend using a test jar to make sure that you're getting a proper lab grade reading. And you may have to pull samples from the vessel a few times, but just remember, as long as everything's properly sanitized, you will be able to add this sample back into the primary after you're done with it. A benefit of doing it in a 6-gallon carboy is that you would only need to pull the sample once, because they're taller and narrower. But take your time. As you can see, we're only at 11.5 minutes right now. And that's total time, not just the amount of time we've spent recording. If this is your first time, I'd say about a half hour to 45 minutes. It really just comes down to how well organized you are and how familiar you are with your equipment. But just relax and take your time. This is supposed to be a hobby and something you find enjoyment from. So now that we have our sample ready, we drop the hydrometer in, give it a twist, and as long as your reading is between 1070 and 1097, you're good to go. And as long as you've cleaned all the equipment, you could just take this sample and dump it right back into the fermenter. It may not seem like a lot, but once you start doing 1-gallon kits, you find out how much wine really gets eaten up by doing samples. That's why we stand by our refractometer, but it comes with its own headaches. Just like this digital hydrometer. It's really handy, but comes with its own downfalls, such as it's not super accurate and shouldn't be used in place of a normal hydrometer. But it's going to give us updates on this chart during its long-term fermentation video. It'll also give us another data point for temperature from within the liquid. And with that, the stage is set for the final ingredient, the yeast. It is important to get your reading before you add the yeast. And if you're going to use scissors, you'll want to make sure those are sanitized. But our hands are already sanitized. And we recommend not using a funnel at this point, as granules of yeast can get stuck to the side of it, and we want to make sure as much of it gets in as possible. And don't mix at this point. We just let it sit on top. So long as the must is room temperature, everything will be fine. And then finally, the last thing we have to do today is put the airlock on top. You could use an S-shaped airlock at this point, but we have more of these 3 pieces laying around, so we'll be using that instead. The more important part is that you would keep the fermentation temperature between 68 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit, or 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. Maintain that for about 14 days. After that, we'll move on to clarifying. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or concerns about your own kits. And if you're yet to order your kit, check out our affiliate links down below, as every bit helps keep this channel afloat.